July 14, 1941, 0615 hours, Orsha, Soviet Union. Oberst Heinrich von Wittenoff's 5th Infantry Division had been advancing through Soviet territory for 3 weeks with the confidence of conquerors. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, had shattered Red Army defences across a 1,000-mile front. German soldiers spoke openly of being home by Christmas, of the Bolshevik regime collapsing like a house of cards. The war in the East would be over in weeks, perhaps days. Von Wittenoff stood outside his command post near the Orsha railway junction, studying maps of the day's advance. His division had captured the town with minimal resistance the previous evening. Soviet forces were retreating in disarray, abandoning equipment, fleeing eastward in panic. It was the same story across the entire front. The Red Army was broken, defeated, finished. Then the sky began to scream. The sound started as a distant wailing, like nothing the German soldiers had ever heard. Not the whistle of artillery shells, not the drone of aircraft engines, but something otherworldly, a banshee shriek that grew louder and more terrible with each passing second. Hundreds of soldiers looked up simultaneously, trying to identify the source of this unearthly howling that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. What happened in the next 10 seconds would haunt German veterans for the rest of their lives. A wall of fire descended from the sky. Not individual explosions, not the sequential impacts of artillery, but simultaneous detonations across a front nearly half a mile wide. The German position simply ceased to exist. Trucks were lifted bodily into the air and torn apart. Trenches collapsed, burying their occupants. Buildings that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble in an instant. The carefully organized German encampment transformed into a landscape of craters and fire. Von Wittenoff's command post took a direct hit. He survived only because he had been standing outside. 32 officers inside were killed instantly. When the German colonel staggered to his feet, his uniform smouldering, his ears ringing with a sound that would never completely fade, he found himself in hell. Fires burned everywhere. Wounded men screamed. The acrid smell of high explosives mixed with burning flesh filled the air. And then, before the survivors could even begin to comprehend what had struck them, the screaming sound began again. The second salvo was even more devastating than the first. German soldiers who had survived the initial barrage and were attempting to organize rescue efforts were caught in the open. The explosions walked across the German positions with mechanical precision, obliterating everything in their path. When the second barrage ended, von Wittenoff's division had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Over 800 men were dead or dying. Every vehicle was destroyed or damaged. The railway station that had been the division's objective was a smoking crater. In the stunned silence that followed, the few German survivors heard a new sound. Engines. Soviet truck engines, already distant, already escaping. Whatever weapon had struck them was mobile, could fire its devastating barrage in seconds, and disappear before German artillery could even locate it. This was something new, something unprecedented, something that would become the most feared weapon on the Eastern Front. The Germans would come to call it Stalin's organ, after the distinctive howling sound the rockets made in flight, reminiscent of the pipes of a church organ. The Soviets called it Katyusha, Little Katy, an affectionate diminutive that belied the weapon's terrifying effectiveness. But names mattered little to the men who experienced its fury. What mattered was the sheer, overwhelming terror of facing a weapon that could erase entire units from existence in seconds, a weapon that announced its arrival with a scream from hell. The BM-13 Katyusha, multiple rocket launcher, represented a revolutionary concept in artillery warfare, though its origins were far from revolutionary. The Soviet military had been experimenting with solid-fuel rockets since the early 1930s, largely due to the efforts of scientists and engineers at the Gas Dynamics Laboratory in Leningrad and the Reactive Scientific Research Institute in Moscow. Unlike conventional artillery, which used carefully machined gun tubes and relied on precision to achieve accuracy, rocket artillery sacrificed accuracy for volume of fire and mobility. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. Mount multiple rocket launch rails on a truck chassis, load the rails with solid fuel rockets, drive to a firing position, launch the entire salvo in seconds, and immediately relocate before enemy counter-battery fire could respond. Each individual rocket was wildly inaccurate compared to a conventional artillery shell. The RS-132 rockets that would evolve into the Katyusha system could miss their aim point by hundreds of meters. But when 16 rockets were fired simultaneously from a single launcher and multiple launchers fired together, accuracy became irrelevant. The target area was simply saturated with high explosive. Development accelerated dramatically in 1938 when the Soviet military recognized the potential of rocket artillery for massed fire support. Engineers led by Andrei Kostakov worked to create a practical vehicle-mounted system. The breakthrough came with the decision to use the ZIS-6 truck as the launch platform. This six-wheel drive truck, produced at the Stalin automobile plant in Moscow, provided the mobility necessary for the hit-and-run tactics that would define Katyusha operations. The final design that emerged in early 1941 mounted 16 launch rails in 2 rows on the truck bed. Each rail held a single M13 rocket, a 42-kilogram projectile with a 4.9-kilogram high-explosive warhead. The rockets were 1.4 meters long with a diameter of 132 millimeters. They were powered by a solid-fuel motor that burned for approximately 2 seconds, accelerating the rocket to 355 meters per second. Maximum range was 8.5 kilometers, though accuracy degraded significantly beyond 5 kilometers. The launch sequence was terrifyingly simple. The truck would stop, the crew would elevate and traverse the rails to the desired angle using manual controls, and then electrical firing circuits would ignite all 16 rockets in rapid succession, typically within 7 to 10 seconds. The entire battery of rockets would be in the air before the first one hit its target. The truck could then drive away immediately, relocating several kilometers before enemy forces could even determine the launch point. The psychological effect was built into the weapon's design, though whether intentionally or accidentally remains debated. The M13 rockets were fin-stabilized, with 4 sheet metal fins at the base. As the rocket flew through the air at high speed, these fins caused the rocket to oscillate slightly, creating airflow patterns that produced the distinctive howling, screaming sound. Each rocket had a slightly different pitch and tone due to manufacturing variations. When 16 rockets were launched simultaneously, the combined sound was unlike anything heard in warfare before. Soldiers who experienced it described it as the sound of hell opening, as the screaming of the damned, as a noise that bypassed rational thought and struck directly at primal fear centers in the brain. The first combat deployment came on July 14, 1941, exactly 23 days after Operation Barbarossa began. The unit chosen for this historic mission was an experimental battery commanded by Captain Ivan Flerov, consisting of 7 BM-13 launchers mounted on ZS-6 trucks. The target was the German-occupied railway station at Orsha in Belarus, a critical logistics hub where German forces were concentrating supplies for the continued advance eastward. Flerov's battery approached Orsha in the pre-dawn hours, moving carefully to avoid German reconnaissance. Soviet intelligence had provided detailed information about German positions around the railway station. At 0615 hours, the 7 Katyusha launchers stopped in a concealed position approximately 6 kilometers from their target. The crews worked quickly, adjusting elevation and traverse. At 0620 hours, Flerov gave the order to fire. 112 rockets screamed into the morning sky. The noise alone was enough to alert German sentries, but the rockets were already beyond interception, already arcing toward their targets. The flight time was approximately 30 seconds. German soldiers at the railway station heard the approaching scream, a sound growing impossibly loud, and then the world exploded. The railway station at Orsha was a large complex of buildings, sidings, and warehouses. German forces had concentrated ammunition, fuel, and supplies there, preparing for the next phase of their advance. In 10 seconds of rocket impacts, this concentration became an inferno. The high explosive warheads, while relatively small compared to conventional artillery shells, achieved their devastating effect through sheer numbers and simultaneous detonation. Buildings collapsed. Ammunition dumps exploded in secondary detonations that would continue for hours. Fuel trucks burst into flame, creating a wall of fire that prevented rescue efforts. German accounts from survivors paint a picture of absolute chaos. Unteroffizier Klaus Becker of the 5th Infantry Division wrote in a letter that reached his family 3 weeks later, before he was killed in subsequent fighting, as the world ended in fire and noise. One moment we were loading supplies, the next moment everything was exploding. The sound alone was enough to drive men mad. It was not like artillery, which you could hear coming and take cover. This was instant destruction, as if God himself had decided to erase us from existence. Men were running in circles, on fire, screaming. Others simply stood frozen, unable to move, unable to think. I survived because I had been standing behind a stone wall that absorbed the blast. When I looked out, I saw nothing but craters and flames. Over 100 of my comrades were dead. We thought the Soviets were finished, beaten. We were wrong. What made the Katyusha attack even more demoralizing was what came after. German artillery observers had been trained to locate enemy guns by their muzzle flashes and sound. They immediately attempted to direct counter-battery fire at the presumed Soviet positions. By the time the first German shells landed, the Katyusha battery was already 5 kilometers away, moving at high speed to a new location. German forces would continue shelling the empty launch site for 30 minutes, expending hundreds of rounds against an enemy that was no longer there. The success at Orsha led to immediate expansion of Katyusha production and deployment. Stalin himself took personal interest in the weapon, recognizing its potential for both tactical effect and propaganda value. The Soviet Union was reeling from the German onslaught. In 3 weeks, the Wehrmacht had advanced hundreds of kilometers, encircled and destroyed entire Soviet armies, and appeared unstoppable. The Katyusha offered a way to strike back, to demonstrate that the Red Army still had teeth. Production of the BM-13 launchers accelerated dramatically. The Voronezh plant produced the first combat units. The compressor plant in Moscow began parallel production. By August 1941, over 30 launchers had been delivered to the Red Army. By October, that number exceeded 100. The M13 rockets themselves were relatively simple to manufacture, requiring no precision machining or complex components. Soviet factories could produce them in enormous quantities, even as German forces approached Moscow. German intelligence struggled to understand what they were facing. Initial reports from the front described some kind of new Soviet multi-barreled artillery system. The distinctive sound led to confusion, with some reports suggesting the Soviets had deployed some kind of psychological warfare device specifically designed to create terror. One German intelligence report from late July 1941 stated that Soviet forces were using sound generators mounted on trucks to demoralize German troops before conventional artillery attacks. The truth emerged gradually as more German units encountered Katyusha attacks. By August 1941, Wehrmacht intelligence had a reasonably accurate picture of the weapon system. What they didn't have was any effective counter to it. Traditional counter-battery tactics were useless against an enemy that could fire and relocate in under a minute. German artillery officers calculated that even if they could immediately identify a Katyusha launch position, their shells would take 60 to 90 seconds to arrive. The Soviet launchers would be long gone. The psychological impact on German troops was severe and immediate. Veteran soldiers who'd fought in Poland, France, and the opening weeks of Barbarossa without flinching found themselves psychologically shattered by Katyusha attacks. The combination of the terrifying sound, the inability to take effective cover, and the helplessness of facing a weapon that struck without warning and disappeared before retaliation was impossible, created what German medical officers began classifying as a specific form of combat stress reaction. Oberarzt, senior medical officer Dr. Wilhelm Hoffmann documented these cases in a report submitted to Wehrmacht Medical Services in September 1941. The report, discovered in German archives after the war, provided clinical detail about the psychological effects of Katyusha attacks. Soldiers exposed to multiple Katyusha bombardments developed what Dr. Hoffmann called Stalin-Organ syndrome. Symptoms included extreme anxiety at any loud noise, involuntary panic responses, inability to sleep, and in severe cases, complete psychological breakdown requiring evacuation from the front. What made Stalin's organ particularly terrifying was the unpredictability. Conventional artillery followed patterns. Forward observers directed fire. There were procedures, routines, things soldiers could understand and adapt to. The Katyusha seemed to strike randomly, without warning, without pattern. A unit might go weeks without encountering it, then be hit 3 times in a single day. The constant uncertainty, the knowledge that at any moment the terrible scream might begin, wore down even the most experienced troops. German soldiers developed superstitions and rituals attempting to protect themselves from Katyusha attacks. Some believed that remaining perfectly still when they heard the scream would save them, as if the rockets somehow targeted movement. Others believed that diving into water, any water, even puddles, would provide protection. These beliefs were irrational, born of desperation to exercise some control over an uncontrollable threat. But they spread through German units like wildfire, evidence of the deep psychological impact the weapon achieved. The sound itself became a weapon of psychological warfare more effective than any propaganda. German soldiers gave the Katyusha various nicknames, all reflecting their fear. Stalin's organ was the most common, but others called it the howling cow, the bellowing bitch, or simply the screamer. Veteran soldiers could identify the sound instantly, even from kilometers away. Many would begin shaking uncontrollably the moment they heard it, their bodies reacting before their conscious minds could process the danger. Gefreiter. Ernst Kleist, a machine gunner with the 6th Infantry Division, survived 4 Katyusha attacks during the advance on Moscow. His account, recorded in a letter to his brother in October 1941, captured the visceral terror the weapon inspired. You cannot understand until you experience it. I've been under artillery fire for months now. I've been strafed by Soviet aircraft. I have faced Soviet tank attacks. None of it compares to the Katyusha. The sound freezes your blood. It is not loud, it is beyond loud. It penetrates into your skull, into your bones. You know you have perhaps 10 seconds before the world explodes, but those 10 seconds feel like an eternity. You cannot run fast enough. You cannot dig deep enough. You can only wait and pray that the next rocket is not aimed at you. When it is over, if you survive, you find yourself shaking so badly you cannot hold your rifle. Some men weep, others vomit. We are all terrified, but we cannot admit it because that would mean the Bolsheviks have broken us. The tactical deployment of Katyusha batteries evolved rapidly, as Soviet commanders learned to maximize their effectiveness. Initial doctrine called for firing from prepared positions with infantry protection. Combat experience quickly demonstrated that mobility was everything. By autumn 1941, Soviet Katyusha units operated as independent maneuver elements, appearing suddenly to deliver devastating fire, then vanishing before German forces could react. The standard Soviet Katyusha battery consisted of 4 to 6 launchers. This provided 96 rockets in a single salvo from 6 launchers, enough to saturate an area of several hectares with high explosive. The batteries operated with reconnaissance elements that identified high-value targets, usually German command posts, artillery positions, or troop concentrations. Once a target was identified, the Katyusha battery would approach within firing range, typically 5 to 6 kilometers. The launchers would deploy in a line separated by 50 to 100 meters to prevent a single German artillery shell from destroying multiple vehicles. The firing sequence was brutally efficient. From the moment the battery stopped moving to the moment the last rocket was launched took approximately 3 minutes. Another minute to stow equipment and begin moving. Total time exposed in the launch position was under 5 minutes. Soviet crews practiced this sequence relentlessly, understanding that speed meant survival. German forces attempting to locate and destroy Katyusha batteries found themselves consistently frustrated. By the time reconnaissance aircraft spotted the distinctive contrails of the rockets and radioed coordinates, the launchers were already relocating. The rockets themselves underwent continuous improvement throughout the war. The original M13 rocket was joined by variants with improved range, larger warheads, and better accuracy. The M30 rocket, introduced in 1942, had a 300mm diameter and carried a massive 28-kilogram warhead. A single salvo of M30 rockets could level entire buildings. The M31 rocket incorporated aerodynamic improvements that extended range to 12 kilometers while improving accuracy. Each iteration made Stalin's organ more deadly, more feared. German forces attempted numerous countermeasures, all with limited success. Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft were tasked with locating Katyusha batteries, but the mobile launchers proved nearly impossible to find among the vast Soviet rear areas. When German aircraft did locate a battery, the Soviets typically had strong anti-aircraft defenses. Even successful air attacks rarely destroyed more than one or two launchers, and Soviet production quickly replaced losses. German artillery developed specialized counter-battery procedures for engaging Katyusha launchers. These required forward observers to immediately identify launch points and call for fire within seconds. Even under ideal conditions, with observers alert and artillery pre-registered on likely launch sites, German shells rarely arrived before the Soviet launchers had relocated. Analysis of German counter-battery records from late 1941 shows that less than 2% of attempts to destroy Katyusha batteries with artillery fire achieved any result. The most effective German tactic was preventive, attempting to keep Soviet forces beyond Katyusha range through aggressive offensive operations. This worked in the early months when Wehrmacht forces were advancing rapidly, but as the front stabilized and German advances stalled, particularly during the winter of 1941, Katyusha batteries operated with increasing freedom. They could approach German lines under cover of darkness, deliver devastating fire at dawn, and disappear into the Soviet rear before German forces could organize a response. The Battle of Moscow, in December 1941, saw Katyusha batteries employed in unprecedented numbers. Soviet commanders had accumulated over 300 launchers in the Moscow military district. These were organized into Guards mortar units, elite formations that received priority for equipment and personnel. The term Guards mortar was itself a security measure, designed to conceal the true nature of these units from German intelligence. The classification of Katyusha launchers as mortars was deliberate misinformation. German forces advancing on Moscow encountered Katyusha fire with increasing frequency and intensity. Major Hans Meyer-Welke, operations officer for the 4th Panzer Division, recorded in his diary the devastating effect of concentrated rocket fire on German positions outside Moscow. December 6, 1941. Soviet rocket artillery has shattered our forward positions. The 12th Infantry Regiment has been effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Casualties exceed 50%, but the psychological damage is worse. Men who survived are refusing to leave their bunkers. Some are deliberately injuring themselves to be evacuated. The sound of the Katyusha launches causes panic even when the rockets land kilometers away. We have no defense against this weapon. Our artillery cannot locate them. Our aircraft cannot find them. We can only endure and hope we are not the next target. The Soviet winter counteroffensive that began in December 1941 relied heavily on Katyusha batteries to break German defensive lines. The standard Soviet tactic involved concentrating multiple batteries on a narrow front, sometimes 12 or more launchers firing simultaneously. This created a rolling barrage of rocket fire that could be walked across German positions, systematically destroying defensive works, killing or demoralizing defenders, and creating gaps for Soviet infantry and armor to exploit. German defensive positions that had withstood conventional artillery bombardment for hours collapsed within minutes under Katyusha fire. The sheer volume of explosives delivered in such a short time overwhelmed German fortifications. Trenches caved in, bunkers collapsed, communication lines were severed, command structures disintegrated as headquarters were hit. And the terrifying sound of the rockets broke the will of soldiers who had endured months of brutal combat. Lieutenant Otto Carius, who had become one of Germany's most famous tank aces, experienced his first Katyusha attack during the winter, fighting outside Moscow. His account, published decades later, captured the unique terror of Stalin's organ. I had faced Soviet T-34 tanks, which were superior to anything we had. I'd been bombed by Soviet aircraft. I'd endured Soviet artillery bombardments that lasted for hours. Nothing prepared me for the Katyusha. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard or ever would hear again. It seemed to come from the sky itself, a choir of banshees screaming our doom. Then the explosions, not sequential but simultaneous, a carpet of fire that erased everything. I survived by pure luck. My tank was behind a ridge that absorbed most of the blast. When I emerged, I found grown men, veterans, experienced soldiers, huddled in their tanks weeping. One officer had shot himself rather than endure another attack. The Soviets broke us that day, not with superior tactics or better equipment, but with a weapon that targeted our minds as much as our bodies. The production scale of Katyusha systems and rockets represented a triumph of Soviet industrial organization under impossible conditions. As German forces advanced deep into Soviet territory in 1941, entire factories were disassembled and relocated hundreds of kilometers eastward. The compressor plant in Moscow, a major producer of Katyusha launchers, was evacuated to Omsk in Siberia. Within weeks of arriving, the plant was producing launchers again. Soviet industrial planners had designed the BM-13 system specifically for mass production under wartime conditions. The launcher rails were simple welded steel. The trucks were existing military vehicles requiring only the addition of the rocket rails. The rockets themselves used stamped metal components and solid fuel that could be mixed by relatively unskilled workers. By the end of 1941, Soviet factories were producing approximately 100 BM-13 launchers per month. Rocket production exceeded 100,000 rounds monthly. These numbers would increase dramatically as evacuated factories reached full production and new facilities came online. By 1942, the Soviet Union was producing more rocket artillery than the rest of the world combined. The M13 rockets cost approximately 1/10 as much as equivalent conventional artillery shells, another advantage that enabled mass production. The German military-industrial complex attempted to develop comparable systems, but never achieved parity. The Nebelwerfer rocket launcher, introduced by Wehrmacht in 1942, was effective but produced in far smaller numbers. German rocket artillery units never achieved the scale or psychological impact of Soviet Katyusha formations. German industrial philosophy emphasized precision and quality, which produced excellent weapons but in limited quantities. Soviet philosophy emphasized quantity and simplicity, producing weapons that were good enough and available in overwhelming numbers. In the case of rocket artillery, the Soviet approach proved decisively superior. The spring and summer campaigns of 1942 saw Katyusha batteries playing increasingly critical roles in Soviet defensive operations. At Stalingrad, Guards mortar units delivered devastating fire on German positions throughout the battle. The urban terrain limited the mobility advantage of Katyusha launchers, but Soviet commanders adapted, using them for carefully planned bombardments that preceded infantry assaults. German soldiers defending the ruins of Stalingrad faced Katyusha attacks that turned entire city blocks into moonscapes of craters and rubble. Obergefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, no relation to the medical officer mentioned earlier, kept a diary throughout the Stalingrad battle. His entries documented the degrading effect of constant Katyusha bombardment on German morale. September 18, 1942. The Russian rocket artillery strikes every morning now, like clockwork. We call it Stalin's morning greeting. Today they hit the 3rd Battalion command post, 17 dead including the battalion commander. The survivors say the screaming sound is worse than the explosions. Men are developing nervous disorders. Some cannot stop shaking. Others hear the Katyusha sound even when it is not there. October 3rd, 1942. Another Katyusha bombardment, the 4th, this week. We have learned there is no safe place. Bunkers collapse. Basements fill with fire. The only protection is luck. I saw a soldier shoot himself today rather than endure another attack. The officers hushed it up, but we all understood. How much can men endure? The German offensive at Kursk in July 1943 encountered Katyusha fire on an unprecedented scale. Soviet intelligence had learned of the German attack plans weeks in advance, allowing Red Army commanders to prepare defenses in depth. Katyusha batteries were concentrated in enormous numbers, with over 300 launchers assigned to support the Central and Voronezh fronts, defending the Kursk salient. Soviet doctrine called for massed Katyusha fire to disrupt German assembly areas before attacks could begin, then continuous bombardment of German penetrations to prevent exploitation. The results were devastating for German forces. Panzer divisions assembled for attack found themselves under Katyusha bombardment hours before they could advance. The rockets couldn't destroy tanks effectively. Their warheads lacked the penetration capability, but they destroyed soft-skinned vehicles, killed infantry, severed communications, and most critically, shattered the coordination necessary for complex combined arms operations. German commanders found their carefully planned attacks degenerating into chaos before a single German soldier crossed the start line. Hauptmann Friedrich von Mellenthin, operations officer for 48th Panzer Corps at Kursk, described the impact in his post-war memoirs. The Soviet rocket artillery made coordinated operations nearly impossible. We would plan an attack, assemble our forces, and just as we prepared to advance, the Katyusha strikes would begin. Hundreds of rockets would saturate our assembly areas. By the time the bombardment ended, our infantry was scattered, our communications destroyed, our schedule disrupted. The few attacks that did go forward lacked the coordination necessary for success. The Soviets had learned to use their rocket artillery as a weapon of operational disruption, not merely tactical destruction. The sound of Stalin's organ became so associated with Soviet attacks that it acquired almost talismanic significance for German troops. Soldiers reported hearing the distinctive scream in their sleep. Some developed physical responses, involuntary shaking or nausea, at any sound remotely similar to rocket launch. German medical facilities behind the lines treated thousands of cases of what modern medicine would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, triggered specifically by exposure to Katyusha attacks. German soldiers developed elaborate theories about Katyusha tactics, most of them wrong but revealing the weapon's psychological impact. Some believed the Soviets had acoustic detection equipment that could identify German positions by sound, explaining how Katyusha batteries seemed to always find important targets. Others believed Soviet agents behind German lines were marking targets for rocket strikes. The reality was simpler. Soviet reconnaissance was excellent. Katyusha batteries were numerous enough to cover all likely target areas, and the random distribution of rocket impacts created an illusion of precision that didn't exist. As the war progressed, and German forces were pushed steadily westward, Katyusha batteries operated with increasing confidence and effectiveness. The BM-13 launchers were joined by improved models, the BM-8 firing smaller 82mm rockets, the BM-31 firing huge 300mm rockets that could demolish buildings. Soviet industry produced over 10,000 launchers of all types during the war, an industrial achievement that dwarfed German production of comparable systems by an order of magnitude. The final campaigns of the war in 1944 and 1945 saw Katyusha batteries participating in every major Soviet offensive. During Operation Bagration, the destruction of German Army Group Center in summer 1944, Guards mortar units delivered massed fire that obliterated entire German divisions. The sound of Stalin's organ became the auditory signature of Soviet victory, a mechanical scream that announced the Red Army's arrival and German defeat. German soldiers who survived the war carried memories of the Katyusha that never faded. Veterans associations in Germany after the war found that former soldiers could still be triggered by sounds resembling rocket launches, sirens, or even strong winds. The psychological scars left by Stalin's organ proved as permanent as any physical wound. In veteran interviews conducted decades later, former Wehrmacht soldiers consistently rated Katyusha bombardment as more terrifying than any other experience of the war. Worse than Soviet armor attacks, worse than air raids, worse than close combat. The BM-13 Katyusha represented more than just an effective weapon system. It embodied Soviet military philosophy, accepting imprecision in exchange for overwhelming volume, emphasizing mobility and mass production over technical refinement, creating psychological effects as important as physical destruction. The distinctive sound, whether designed or accidental, became an integral part of the weapon's effectiveness. German soldiers feared the Katyusha not just for what it could do, but for what it represented. The industrial might of the Soviet Union turned into a screaming instrument of vengeance. The total production of M13 rockets during the war exceeded 5.5 million rounds. Soviet batteries fired these rockets in salvos measured in tens of thousands during major operations. The city of Berlin's final battle saw Katyusha batteries firing point-blank into German defensive positions, the terrible scream echoing through rubble-filled streets as Stalin's organ played its final symphony of destruction. German defenders, many of them teenage boys of the Hitler Youth and elderly men of the Volkssturm, experienced in those final days the same terror that veterans of the Eastern Front had known for nearly 4 years. The weapon that German soldiers called Stalin's organ achieved something no conventional artillery system ever did. It created terror through sound as much as through explosive effect. It demonstrated that industrial warfare had evolved beyond precision to embrace saturation. And it proved that sometimes the most effective weapon is not the most accurate or sophisticated, but the one that breaks the enemy's will to fight. The howling of the Katyusha rockets became the sound of German defeat, a mechanical scream that announced the Reich's approaching doom. For the men who heard it and survived, that sound never truly ended. It echoed in their nightmares, in their memories, in their souls. Stalin's organ had played them a tune they would never forget, a terrible melody of fire and terror that marked the price of invading the Soviet Union. The weapon was simple, crude by technical standards, wildly inaccurate in individual shots. But in mass salvos accompanied by that unearthly scream, the BM-13 Katyusha became something more than a weapon. It became the voice of Soviet fury, the sound of retribution, the mechanical embodiment of a nation's rage. And for the German soldiers who heard it, it was quite simply the most terrifying weapon of the war.